Today, we come to the second temptation. Now, this one is subtle. In fact, the more religious, the more spiritual, the more Christian you are, the bigger this one is. The less spiritual or Christian or whatever, this is less of a temptation for you. This is such a subtle temptation. You could go years and years as a Christian or as a God follower and not even realize you're falling to this temptation. It is so incredibly subtle. It's the temptation to presume on God. It's the temptation to assume, God will take care of that. God would never. God will always. Isn't God a good God? Doesn't God want me to be happy? Isn't God a God of grace? Isn't God a God of forgiveness? I can kind of launch into my life any way I want to, and God's going to take care of me. Let me kind of set it up for you. Matthew chapter 4 is where you find these temptations. Matthew chapter 4, and we're jumping into the second one. Matthew chapter 4, verse 5. And Jesus has fasted for 40 days, or more than 40 days. Now he's hungry, the Bible tells us. He's been tempted to make food. Isn't it interesting that, just a little side note, that Jesus, number one, the first temptation he faced had to do with food. And for many of you, your biggest temptation has to do with food. I just think that's interesting, isn't it? You don't think that's interesting. I just thought it was interesting. Or maybe it's convicting. I don't know. Then the devil, verse 5, Matthew chapter 4, verse 5. Here we go. Then the devil took him to the holy city. Now that's Jerusalem. And we don't know if it was like a Star Trek moment where then whoa, no, or if they walked there. They could have walked there. You just assumed that there was some magic thing, but maybe they went traipsing out of the desert, walked to Jerusalem, and climbed up on the back of the temple. Anyway, took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. So now Jesus and the tempter are standing on the highest point of the temple, which is a couple hundred feet or more high. I don't know what the highest point you could actually stand on was in the ancient temple, but they're way up. And the idea was they're looking down in the courtyard. And people are coming and going, and there's the chief priest and the not-so-chief priest and the other priest, and there's some leaders, and there's some Gentiles out there, and there's some Jewish people coming in to do their thing. And apparently, they're seeing all of this activity down there in the temple courtyard, and they're standing up there on the highest place. In verse 6, the tempter says to Jesus, if you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down. Just jump. Because after all, and then this is pretty slick, the devil quotes a verse out of Psalms to Jesus. Because see, the first time Satan tempted Jesus, Jesus says, it is written, thou shalt not live by bread alone. Satan's going, I can play that game. Throw yourself off. It is written. He will command, talking about God, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus, look, come on. You and I both know you're going to have a hard time impressing these people. You and I both know that you're going to go down there and walk in there and go, I'm the Son of God. And they're going to go, yeah, there's several of those have come by in the last 40 or 50 years, right? Tell us something new. You know the hardest group to prove your deity to is the religious leaders right there. I got an idea. Look, just jump. Look, God's not going to let something happen to you. You're the man. You're Jesus. Look, it has taken God about 700 years to get you here. I mean, do you realize he had to choose a man, made him a family, made him a nation, took him to Egypt, 400 years of captivity, took him back to the promised land, got all these buildings built and all this stuff. I mean, God has gone to great lengths to get you here. If you jump, he's not going to let something happen to you. Besides, here's this verse. Look, I will not let you be broken and busted and beat up. I'm not going to let you stumble. God's going to take care of you. So Jesus, why don't you come up with a great plan, and then God will kind of intervene. Just jump, and when these people go, there's a guy jumped off, you'll hit the ground, dust off, and they'll go, whoa, who are you? And you can say, I'm Jesus, the Son of God. They're going to believe. You're in. This is done. Just jump. Why don't just come up with a great plan, pull the trigger on your plan, and then trust God to come in and bail you out, because it says right here he's going to bail you out. Now, Jesus, why don't you jump? Now, you may not realize this. We do this with God all the time. This is the subtle temptation of a person who's a God follower, a person who takes God seriously, a person that takes the Bible seriously. It's the temptation to presume on God. It is the temptation to launch a bunch of ideas and say, God, you're going to help me, aren't you? God, you're going to bless me, aren't you? God, you're going to come through for me. After all, you're a good God. After God, as if God's going, that's right. I am. Thank you. And God, you're a God of grace. That's right. God, you're a God who provides. It says right here in my Bible, my God shall provide all of my needs according to his riches and glory. And I've got some needs, so you have to meet my needs. And God's going, you got me. You found that verse. Okay, what do I need to do? It's the temptation to presume and to assume on God. It's the equivalent of the 17-year-old guy who's in the car with his buddies, and they're back there doing stuff they shouldn't do, and they got stuff in the car they shouldn't have in the car, and he's driving around, and one of them says, hey, Man, I hope we don't get busted. And the driver says, don't worry, my dad's a lawyer. If we get caught, I'll just call my old man. He'll get us out. Don't worry, just do it. Just keep on going. Go faster. Because my old man, he won't let us go down. He'll bail us out. He'll keep us out of trouble. Yeah, he might, but aren't you making some assumptions? You see, here's the deal. Here's what happens. In that scenario I just described, see, the Father is the authority, and the Father is in charge, but the Son is forcing the Father into a position to where actually the Father becomes subservient to the Son. I'm going to force my Father to do something for me. I'm going to put myself in a position where my Father has no options but to come and rescue me. I'm going to assume or presume on His power, assume on His influence, presume and assume on His greatness. And that's what Satan was tempting Jesus to do. He's going, look, the old man, he's going to take care of you. Jump, make your point. He'll come through for you. It says right here in the Bible, he's going to take care of you. Come up with a plan, pull the trigger on it, and then trust God to show up and bail you out. Right? It's the young lady, and I kind of alluded to it, who says, I know he's not a Christian, and we share different values, and we don't have much in common. But once I marry him, I'll start praying. Doesn't God answer prayer? Yeah, I don't think that's what it's talking about, Or, it's a kid who doesn't study and goes to school and says, now, God, my mom and dad's always said you've answered prayer. You don't want me to flunk out. You want me to make something of myself. And besides, it would be a bad testimony if I were to flunk this test and blah, 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 blah. And here's some verses, but they didn't study. And so I'm going to put myself in a bad situation and try to force God to intervene for me. It's the couple who's just totally irresponsible with their money. And then all of a sudden they get in a situation where they're kind of, feeling the pain from their irresponsibility financially. They start praying and finding verses and quoting scripture. And, I'm really trusting and praying. And got some, I'm going to get my friends praying. And, come on, God, you got to come through for us. God, if people find out you didn't come through for us, that somehow I'm going to force God to act on my behalf. In Christian circles, and if you're not like a church person, you'll get a kick out of this. In church world, we actually have terminology for this. This is like part of our theology. It's absurd, but it's part of our theology. And here's how it sounds in church world. We're just going to step out on faith and trust God. We're just going to step out. You know what that usually means? We've come up with an idea that's not very well researched, defies common sense, defies wisdom. We've got no counsel. This probably won't work. But we're going to step out on faith. We're going to pull the trigger on this idea, and we're going to just trust God. In other words, we've come up with something. We're going to throw our energies into it, and God is going to have to bail us out, because it says right here, but my God shall supply all of your needs, and God is faithful, and God is rich in mercy, and God is in grace. So we're going to launch it, and then we're going to trust God to come bail us out. That is not faith. That is presumption. Most of the times it's stupid, And then when God doesn't come through or the miracle doesn't happen, everybody's mad at God. And God's going, it wasn't even my idea. You got yourself thrown in jail, and yeah, I'm an attorney, but we should have had a conversation about this before you decided to get yourself thrown in jail, before you went into all that debt, before you decided not to study. I'm God. I'm not a genie in a lamp. I don't do your bidding. I'm God, and yes, I'm rich in mercy, and I'm rich in grace, and I'm all those things. But before I'm all those things, I'm God. You don't play me. You don't manipulate me. You don't force my hand. And see, in our Christian terminology, God would never. And God will always. And God will, and God, and God, and God, and God, and God. And we just assume and assume and assume and presume. And here's what happens. When we do that, as we're going to see in just a minute, we think we're living by faith. And it has nothing to do with faith. And we're going to talk about this later in the year. Faith is not coming up with an idea, pull the trigger on the idea, and then ask God to bless it. That's not faith, that's hope. And hope is good, but hope sometimes doesn't work out. You don't get everything you hope for. Faith is simply responding to the promises of God, not your bad ideas. Faith is simply responding to what God has promised He's going to do. It's not coming up with something and then jumping out there and asking God to bail you out. And that's exactly what this temptation was. Jesus, I got a great idea. Don't you want their attention? Yeah. Don't you want to demonstrate who you are? Yeah. Wouldn't you like to start with the chief priest and all the guys? Yeah. Well, I got an idea. I got a plan. You jump. God will suddenly go, oh no, Jesus, jump. He'll rush to your rescue because you're not going to let something happen to you. This plan's been going on for hundreds of years. He'll come to your aid, it'll all work out, and, there you go. It's like, you ever done this where you have something of value to somebody and you throw it up in the air and say, think quick. And what do? Oh, catch it. That's what Satan's doing. That's what we do with God. Think quick, God, I just came up with a really bad idea. Hope you catch it because I'm trusting you. I've told people you're going to come through for me. Got a verse. Now listen to what Jesus says. This is so powerful. I just love this. This is why when I read these things, I think this is true. Wow. Jesus, because he knows his people's history, the nation of Israel's history, like he did last week, he reaches back into a time of history where the nation of Israel came up against the very same temptation. This isn't new. Satan's not coming out with new stuff. It's the same stuff for all of us. That's why these three temptations, they're sort of the category, the umbrella for all of our temptations. He reaches back to a time in history, and let me tell you the story in history, and I'll read you a couple of verses. You don't need to look them up. There was a time when after the nation of Israel left Egypt, remember God under Moses took them out, and they wandered around in the desert for a lot of years, over 40 years, because they disobeyed God, and God decided to let a whole generation of them die before they went into the promised land. Interesting story. And so they're wandering around the desert, and God's feeding them every morning. We talked about that last week, and he's feeding them in the afternoons. We haven't talked about that story yet. And they get to a place, it's called the desert of Sin, S-I-N. Doesn't mean sin like English sin. It's a Hebrew term and has nothing to do with sin. It's just the word. They're in the desert of Sin, and they're in a place where there's no water. Now, they have an option. They're marching through the desert going, we're like out of water, and there's like 2 million of us, so we can't find a stream. We got to find a lake. There's no water. They're marching through the desert. They come to this little city, Rephaim, or I think that's how you say it. Not a city, but a place there in the desert. And they have an option, and here are their options. Okay, option number 1, God delivered us miraculously from Egypt, killed half of Pharaoh's army, feeds us every morning and every night, and I don't know where the water's going to come from, but you know what? We'll just trust God. God got us into this. God will get us through it. We'll just trust God. Let's just sing another chorus, with our parched throats. That was one option. The other option is let's taunt God. Let's tell God. Let's remind God of who he is in no uncertain terms. And by the way, let's start with Moses. And so they chose option number 2, and they begin to tempt God in the sense of taunting God, in the sense of saying, hey, you're not going to let us down now, are you? Aren't you the God of goodness and grace and mercy? Aren't you the God that comes through? And aren't you? Not in a respectful, trustful way, but in a taunting kind of way. Here's the way it came down. Exodus chapter 17, verse 2. I'm kind of jumping into the middle of the story. So they being the nation, the people, so they quarreled with Moses and they said, give us water to drink. Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses, and they said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? They're just taunting. I thought you were good. I thought you were trustworthy. I thought you could do something. You're not going to do anything. You can't do anything. We were lied to. You're not who you say you are. Taunt. Try to force God's hand. Try to force Moses to force God's hand. Well, God was merciful that day, and I'll let you read it for yourself, but it is an incredible miracle, and he provides water for all of these people in the desert. Verse 7, and he being Moses, he called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord not among us? Come on, God. Come on, God, do something, God, we dare you. They taunted God. And so Moses marked this place by naming it something that would always remind them in their history of this incident where they tested or tried God. Now, hang with me. That's the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is the story of what the people did as they wandered from Egypt to the promised land. Now, there's another book in the Bible, Deuteronomy. We mentioned this last week. Deuteronomy was written after the people got to the promised land, and Deuteronomy is basically a speech that Moses gave to the people of Israel to remind them of their history. And he goes back through and he says, remember how God was faithful, remember how God was faithful, remember how God was faithful, because before you go into the promised land, I want you to remember you can trust God for physical needs, you can trust God in military with military issues, you can trust God. So he gives a speech and he refers back to all that actually happened and is recorded in the book of Exodus. So Exodus is the history, Deuteronomy is the speech. Listen to what Moses says in the speech as it relates to this incident that took place in the desert. Deuteronomy 6:16, here's just this one verse. He says, do not, now he's reflecting back over their history, do not test the Lord your God as you did at Massah. In other words, hey, when you get into the land and you got houses and cities and armies and wealth, whoa, don't you give in to the temptation to taunt your God or to try to force your God's hand or to get yourself in a situation where you've been disobedient, which they did many times, and then once you were facing the consequences of your disobedience, say, oh, but I thought you loved me, and oh, but I thought you were the God that delivered, and oh. Don't you test or taunt the Lord your God. Yes, he's rich in grace and mercy, but he's God. So there's Jesus standing there, on the top, probably not, on the top of the deal with, Satan. Satan's going, come on, I got a good idea. You jump, God will come through for you. It'll be great. Jesus reaches back, verse 7, Matthew 4:7. Jesus answered him, it's also written, by the way. You've given me, and it's been written. It's also been written. Do not put the Lord your God to the test. And he reaches back into the book of Deuteronomy, which is a reflection of that story in the desert. And he brings it all front and center to Satan and says, okay, I know what you're up to. You're tempting me to test God. And I don't test him. I don't assume, I don't presume, I don't manipulate. I'm here to cooperate with my Heavenly Father. And no, I'm not going to jump. I'm not going to try to force his hand. I'm not going to do it. See, this is so subtle. It's so subtle. Now, I could just condense the whole thing down to this one little phrase. It's simply this, that as Christians, we've been called to cooperate with God, not manipulate God. It's that simple. We've been called to cooperate. That is, you wake up every day and you say, God, today, there's going to be all kind of issues and temptations and stuff going on and things I wish you would do. But you know what? To this day, I'm going to cooperate. I'm not going to spend my day trying to manipulate, talk you into things, faith you into things, set up situations that are going to force your hand. Hey, think quick, God, none of that. I'm here this day to cooperate, not manipulate.